Hey everyone, today we're going to talk about weathering. So, what exactly is weathering? Well, weathering is the natural process that results in the breaking down or breaking apart of rock. And the really cool thing is that weathering is responsible for the breaking apart or the geologic changes of rock on the surface of the earth. And if you look here, these four pictures are some really cool examples of the results of weathering. These terms that are listed here are terms that you'll be able to describe and explain by the end of this presentation, and you'll also be able to relate them to one another. So when we talk about weathering, there are two different types of weathering. The first type that we're going to talk about is mechanical weathering or physical weathering. So that's what's happening down here. And mechanical weathering is when rocks are broken apart, however, their chemical structure or composition is the same. So we're not changing the rocks on a molecular level, and that's what's happening here, where this rock is broken apart. But if you look at the fragment or the piece on the left and you look at the piece on the right, they're still made up of the same minerals. Now this picture up here, this is the second type of weathering, and that's chemical. So what happens during chemical weathering is the chemical formula or chemical structure of the rock is changed. So some type of reaction is occurring to change the rock. There are three different types of mechanical weathering. There's ice wedging, biological, and abrasion. Ice wedging is probably the type of weathering that you are most familiar with, since we live in the northeast region of the United States. And ice wedging happens when you have the freezing and thawing process occurring. So the way it works is you have water that can seep into the cracks of rocks, and then that water freezes. And when it freezes, it expands and makes even larger cracks in the rock. And so this happens over and over again as the temperatures fluctuate and water gets into the cracks and freezes until eventually you have large rocks that are just broken apart. And an example of ice wedging that we're all super familiar with is potholes. So water gets into cracks in the asphalt in our roads, it freezes, expands, makes those cracks even bigger, and this process just happens over and over again until you have monster-sized potholes. The second type of mechanical weathering is biological weathering, and that happens when anything that's living physically breaks apart rock. So in this example here, these tree roots from this old tree are growing down, and they are growing through and breaking apart the rock. Biological weathering can also happen as a result of animals. So you have burrowing animals that travel through the soil and move that soil aside and then expose some of the rock underneath it to the outside elements, and that can cause it to weather and break apart. Here's another picture of biological weathering. This is showing you another example of what we saw in the first biological weathering picture. So you have these tree roots that are growing along this rock face, and as they're growing through it, they're causing it to break apart. The third type of mechanical weathering is abrasion. And so abrasion happens when you have rock particles, or you have wind or water that rubs against rocks or rock formations and causes them to change and break apart. So this really cool rock structure that you're seeing here, the sandstone butts on the Colorado Plateau, this swirling pattern, it's formed from fragments of the rock, the sandstone fragments that are being whipped around by the wind. It's caused by, as they're moving, they're carving these like layering striations into the rock. This is another example of abrasion. As the water moves in and out with the tide, it rubs against this piece of rock here, and it slowly causes it to weather away. Another example of abrasion: as the water flows down this waterfall, it rubs against the rock, and that abrasion causes the weathering. And sometimes when you have really, really, really small particles in the water, or the water itself rubbing against the rock, it can make it really smooth and form these natural water slides. And this rock formation here, or this weathering that caused this rock, was most likely due to winds whipping through between these two gigantic rocks here. And if you guys look closely too, you can see cracks in here. So if this is in a climate where there's freezing and thawing, eventually over time, if these cracks widen enough, this whole piece of rock could break off. All right, the last picture example of abrasion is a picture of the Grand Canyon. And the Grand Canyon formed by the Colorado River flowing through and carving out this giant canyon, and that is a result of abrasion. All right, the other type of weathering, chemical weathering, has 6 different types. There's hydrolysis, leaching, carbonation, oxidation, acid precipitation, and plant acids. All right, so for hydrolysis, I'm not going to go into the nitty-gritty here, but I just want you guys to know that hydrolysis occurs when water reacts with the rock and breaks it down and changes it. Leaching, leaching is when water travels through the rock, and as it travels through, it reacts with the minerals and it actually pulls them or separates them from the other minerals and pulls them through the rock. So that's what happened here. As the water went through, it's pulling out those minerals. So you can actually see these different colors here are different types of minerals that are being leached out of the rock. And we've seen leaching before. If you can remember back to acid mine drainage, when those minerals were leached out of the open, those minerals leached out of the open mines. All right, the third type of chemical weathering is carbonation, and that happens when water and carbon dioxide combine and make carbonic acid. And so that carbonic acid then can disintegrate or dissolve softer types of rocks such as limestone. And carbonation is responsible for forming underground caves and caverns, like what you see in this picture here. So these caverns here in Mexico were formed from that carbonation process. The next type of chemical weathering is oxidation, and you've probably experienced oxidation before if you've ever left a bike out in the rain for a long period of time. And that's when oxygen and oxygen and water change the metal or the rock and cause it to weaken. So what happens here is the oxygen combines with the rock or the minerals that are in the rock and chemically changes them, and then they are weakened and will break down. We've talked about acid precipitation before. So when you have different types of emissions that are released into the atmosphere, they can then combine with water and become things like sulfuric acid. And when it rains sulfuric acid, or when it rains acidified rain, that can end up causing the weathering of different types of rock structures, especially softer types of rock structures, such as this one, which is carved out of marble. The last type of chemical weathering that we're going to talk about is plant acids, and we've talked about plant acids before. So plant acids what ends up happening is when you have things like lichens, which you're seeing here in this picture, when they attach to rocks, they secrete acids, and those acids start to break down the rock. And we see this in primary succession, and that's how soils are initially formed. If you guys can remember all the way back, we talked about lichens being pioneer species, and so those are the first ones to arrive, and they attach to the rock, secrete their acids, break it down, and eventually they are going to start to form the soil. All right, so just to sum it all up, the 6 types of chemical weathering are carbonation, plant acids, acid rain, leaching, oxidation, and hydrolysis. Okay, so the last thing to talk about are what changes the rate of weathering. There are 4 different things that can affect the rate of weathering, so they can either speed it up or slow it down. So the first thing that we look at is rock composition. What is the rock made of? If you guys remember back, we talked about rocks being made up of minerals. So what are the minerals that make up the rock? And depending on the type of mineral that makes the rocks up, that determines the rate of weathering. Also, the amount of exposure. Does it have a lot of surface area that's going to be exposed to the elements? And if so, then it's going to have a much higher rate of weathering. Also, what climate is it in? If the rocks are in a climate where it's a much warmer temperature and it receives a lot of rainfall, the rate of weathering is going to happen much quicker. When you have cold, dry climates, the rate of weathering is much, much slower. And last thing is topography. Right? How high up in elevation are those rocks? Rocks that are on steep slopes are going to have much higher rates of weathering. So this chart here, what you're seeing, the whole purpose of me showing it to you is that it shows you the factors controlling the rates of weathering. And so these are slow to fast. And so if we look at this, these are the different types of minerals. So if you have a rock that's made up of a very hard type of mineral, such as quartz, it's going to weather slowly. If you have a rock that's made up of a much softer type of mineral, such as calcite, it's going to weather much quicker. And then here are the other types of factors that affect the rates of weathering. And this here is another graphic that will give you a stronger sense of the different rates of weathering. All right, so higher rainfalls, higher temperatures, much quicker chemical weathering. All right, lastly, I just want to go through some pictures here. And while I'm going through them, I want you to think about the different types of weathering that are happening here. So is it chemical or is it physical? And then see if you can figure out which type of chemical or physical it is. So for this one right here, just to start things off, this is physical or mechanical, right? Those are kind of used interchangeably. So this mechanical weathering, and it is caused by abrasion. All right, so think about what type of weathering is happening here. This is from Arches National Park in the United States. This is on the coast. And then lastly, this one. And that's it.